Hey, this is Pastor Bunjee Garrett, and I want to take some time today to present you with another word of encouragement. Now, in case you haven't heard already, you might like to know that our country is now filled with pro-Hamas activists. You know, the ones who block city streets and keep us from getting to the airport on time and are currently occupying college campuses across our country. They're literally calling for genocide, and just to be clear, they're calling for the genocide of the Jews. Now, with that being the case, I want to take a moment to consider the hypocrisy of those who cry out for genocide because they're opposed to genocide. Think about it. The pro-Hamas activists, they believe that Israel is actually guilty of engaging in genocide. Therefore, according to these protesters, the solution for genocide is to call for the genocide of the Jews. This is exactly what they mean when they declare, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They're calling for the extermination of the Israelis living there in the land of promise. This call for genocide was more clearly stated just this past week on the campus of Columbia. That's when one student declared, and I quote, "Remember the 7th of October. That will happen not one more time, not 5 more times, not 10 more times, not 100 more times, not 1,000 more times, but 10,000 times." Now just think about that for a moment. This student, this activist at Columbia was calling for October the 7th to be repeated by 10,000 more times. And listen, there were students at Columbia University who celebrated this idea. Now, just to be clear, I want to remind you, it was October the 7th of last year when the Gazan government invaded southern Israel. And it was on that day when those Gazan terrorists, they killed 1,200 people and captured nearly 250 hostages. So listen, when the students there at Columbia cry out for October the 7th to be repeated 10,000 more times, they're actually calling for the execution of 12 million Jews. 12 million Jews. This is twice the total number of Jews killed during Hitler's Holocaust. Another protester was heard declaring this, and I quote, "Are you ready? 7th of October is about to be every day. Every day. 7th of October is going to be every day for you." That's right. There was this pro-Hamas activist there at Columbia who then called for the genocide of the Jews by crying out for October the 7th to be repeated each and every day. Every day until when? Well, every day until the land from the river to the sea is free from the descendants of Israel. So yeah, these pro-Hamas activists here in our country, those who accuse Israel of engaging in genocide, they're the ones that are literally calling for the genocide of the Jews. And yet they can't see the hypocrisy in this political position. In order to further grasp their hypocrisy, let's take a moment to consider the question, is the state of Israel really guilty of engaging in genocide? Now, as we begin to consider this question, we should first acknowledge the tragic fact that there are civilian casualties on both sides of this conflict. And so whether we're talking about the innocent civilian victims in Gaza or the innocent victims there in Israel, we have to agree that both accounts are equally tragic. Having said that, I also realize that the number of civilian casualties in Gaza is greater. And I have no doubt that we've all seen videos that, Arabs in Gaza have posted as they accuse the IDF of war crimes like genocide. And while these videos are truly horrific, it's also important for us to understand that there is actually a calculated reason for why there are so many civilian casualties there in Gaza. You might not know this, but the Gazan government launches their attacks against Israel from civilian centers. As a matter of fact, Hamas hides their command centers under hospitals. They launch rockets from public schools and shopping centers and churches. And not only that, but they also launch rockets from humanitarian zones, which are set up in Gaza for the specific purpose of providing civilians there a safe haven. Now, just think about that for a moment. We send money to Gaza for the purpose of humanitarian aid. That money is then used to set up humanitarian zones in Gaza, which are then filled with civilians seeking refuge. Then the Gazan government uses those humanitarian zones as locations for launching rockets into Israel. Israel then responds by targeting the launch points, which then impacts these civilians in the humanitarian zones. And then they film it, the videos are then posted online, and Israel then is accused of war crimes as Hamas continues to gaslight us. Case in point, listen, Hamas terrorists launched launched 12 rockets toward Israeli civilians in the city of Beersheba there in southern Israel. And according to the reports, those rockets were launched from a location in Rafah where evacuated civilians from southern Gaza had fled for safety. And so just think about that for a moment. The Gazan government launched rockets at Israeli civilians in Beersheba, and they launched those rockets from a humanitarian zone located in the Gazan city of Rafah. And while it's true that the rockets they launched were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome, it's also true that one of those rockets misfired and caused a great deal of damage there in that so-called humanitarian zone. Now, according to the Geneva Conventions, listen, parties involved in military conflict must distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives. And yet, despite these international protocols, the Gazan government not only launches rockets at civilian centers in Israel, but they also launch these attacks from civilian centers in Gaza, thereby using their civilians as human shields for their military operations. And then, when the IDF targets those launch points in Gaza, the number of civilian casualties increase, of course. But rather than blaming Hamas, the Arabs in the Gaza Strip gaslight the world by insisting that the IDF is actively committing war crimes by targeting civilian centers. They're just targeting, the launching of rockets, which just so happens to be in civilian centers by the design of Hamas. And it's sad to say that many students here in the West have been brainwashed by Palestinian propaganda, and as a result, they can't hear their own hypocrisy as they cry out for the genocide of the Jews. So is the state of Israel engaging in genocide against the Arabs who are living there in the Gaza Strip? Well, with this question in mind, let's quickly consider the demographics of Israel. You might not know this, but 21% of Israeli citizens are classified as Arab. This includes Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs and the Druze. And so listen, if the state of Israel is attempting to commit genocide against the Arabs, then they're really failing. They're failing to exterminate the 2 million Arab citizens currently living in Israel. Now, with all this in mind, I want to consider the current demographic of Gaza. According to the most recent numbers, the population of Gaza is 99.6% Muslim, most of whom are Sunni. There are also around 3,500 Arabs who subscribe to Roman Catholicism or Greek Orthodoxy, but when you add this up, along with the teeny tiny number of Baptists who are there, the non-Muslim population in Gaza is around 0.4%. As for the Jews, zero, none. And so again, almost a quarter of the population in Israel is Arab, while 0% of the Gazan population is Israeli. You might not know this, but Gaza once had a sizable Jewish community with a history going back at least 3,000 years. But then the majority of the Jewish people there in Gaza fled following the 1929 Palestine riots. By 2004, there were 21 Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. But then by 2005, the state of Israel decided to disengage from Gaza. And by September 2005, all of the Israeli settlers in Gaza were evicted by Israeli security forces over a period of 7 days. So yeah, there are no Israelis living in the Gaza Strip. And one reason why? It's because the Arabs living in the Gaza Strip won't stand for it. You see, they don't really care about diversity and equity and inclusion. No, instead, they want to wipe Israel from the face of the map. Sadly, it was back in 2003 when Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, he bought into the belief that the state of Israel can exchange land for peace, which is why he encouraged the complete disengagement of Gaza. It was shortly thereafter when the Arabs in Palestine handed the government over to Hamas. And ever since then, Hamas has been attacking the state of Israel from Gaza and with very little success. Listen, if the Gazan government would stop attacking Israel, then Gaza and Israel could exist in peace. Conversely, if Israel fails to destroy Hamas, then Hamas will continue trying to accomplish their stated goal. And their stated goal can be found in the Hamas Covenant of 1988. According to one summation, the most relevant portions of the document's 36 articles can be summarized as falling within 4 main points. Firstly, they want the complete destruction of Israel as an essential condition for the liberation of Palestine and the establishment of a theocratic state based on Islamic law, which is Sharia law. Secondly, they need for both unrestrained and unceasing holy war, jihad, to attain the above objective. Thirdly, the deliberate disdain for and dismissal of any negotiated resolution or political settlement of Jewish and Muslim claims to the Holy Land. And then fourthly, the reinforcement of historical anti-Semitic tropes and slanderous statements. That's right, since 1988, Hamas has been perfectly clear about their plans to commit genocide by wiping Israel from the face of the map. And it's sad to say that their ongoing reinforcement of historical anti-Semitic tropes and slanderous statements has clearly had a cult-like effect on many of the students who claim to be all about diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're opposed to genocide, which is why they're calling for the genocide of the Jews. This is all just hypocritical. And with all this in mind, I encourage you to realize that the Gazan government, better known as Hamas, is actually the guilty party that's actively engaging in the attempted genocide of the Jews, according to their own statements. Unfortunately for them, they find themselves in opposition with the true and living God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and so they will not succeed. And with that being the case, we can rejoice in knowing that they will not succeed, and yet at the same time, I encourage every Christian to realize that this is a perfect opportunity for us to stand with Israel and to stand with Israel as we proclaim the good news of Israel's Messiah and our Messiah, Jesus Christ. This is a perfect time for us to preach the gospel message of Jesus Christ so that unbelievers on both sides of this conflict might turn and trust in Christ Jesus. And with this as our goal, let's ask for the Holy Spirit to empower us as we continue to fight the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.